Well, Amelia, thank you so much for joining me at long last. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
All right, so we're going to rewind a little bit to kick off this episode. So you started riding like so many of us, 8 years old, horse crazy little girl, and eventually you were competing around New South Wales, Australia, in and around the Sydney area, and in mostly eventing and also some show jumping as well. Correct?
Yeah, exactly. So when I started, typical little girl, I begged my dad for a pony and I begged my mom, and they said no. And when I was 9, I got my first pony, and we started in show jumping around Sydney. And later, when I turned a teenager, we'd moved further west out of Sydney to a cattle farm, and in that area, eventing was very common. So I sort of fell into eventing at that point.
Yeah. And then on a Tuesday afternoon, May 18th, 2010, after this just totally normal life of being a horse crazy girl, eventing, riding like we all do, just being so enthralled by this amazing sport that you can do with horses. You were about 10 minutes from home. You were coming home from university, and your whole life changed. Take me back to that moment.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to imagine that it was very near 14 years ago actually. So exactly what you've said. So I was on my way home from university, and 18 years old, brand new car, just got my driver's license, and thought, well, let's try the university thing, ride at the same time, can still live at home, and completely it's really the perfect perfect example of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I was driving, and a car came around the corner on my side of the road completely, and there was no time to react. And unfortunately, we had a head-on accident, and at reasonably high speed. And in about 2 seconds, it was all over. So I spent 2.5 years in a wheelchair as a result of the accident, and the other driver was, fortunately or unfortunately, depends on how you look at it, he walked away with no injuries. So
Wow.
it was completely his fault. And it was a wrong place, wrong time, as I said. So he was driving on the wrong side of the road. He was Canadian, thought he was on the correct side of the road. Turns out in Australia we're on the wrong side. So he'd actually turned onto the road that we had the accident on, and he'd bent down to pick up a cigarette off the floor of his car. And as he looked up, he was a bit disorientated and went back to what he knew. And about less than 2 seconds later, he went around a very sharp, from his perspective, a very sharp right-hand hairpin turn. And I was coming in the other direction. So we didn't see each other at all, both traveling approximately 100. I think he was doing about 80 kilometers an hour. I was doing about 65. And we met right on the apex of the turn. So didn't see each other, didn't have any time to react. He obviously thought he was right. I thought I was right, and yeah, of course we met right on the apex of the turn. So no time to react, and he was, I mean, laws of physics. His car was bigger. He was traveling faster, so my car was worse off, and as a result of the accident itself, I ended up spending 2.5 years in a wheelchair and recovering from various injuries. So it was rather, I suppose you could look at it two ways. So for a lot of things that went wrong, a lot of things went right. So I had a brand new car, so that's basically why I'm still here. And the paramedics were on the scene very quickly. I went to the base hospital in our hometown, and the surgeon was on call, and he was very quick to respond. And as a result, I was in hospital approximately 2 weeks in the beginning, but they were so concerned with the initial injury that they didn't pick up on a lot of other injuries that became apparent over the following sort of 1 to 2 years after the accident. So the biggest, most serious injury at the time was my left leg was completely severed from my body. So they were very concerned that I would lose my leg. And they obviously talked about amputation, and I begged them not to because, you know, I'm a rider. I don't want to ride without my leg, and they
Was
said,
that moment, because I've heard your story before and it made me cry the first time, it's gonna make me cry again. That moment of begging to keep your leg is so profound to me. Like, that is so unfathomable to me because you grew up, you know, Paralympians and para athletes come from all different sorts of backgrounds, but you grew up as like an able-bodied rider. And so all of a sudden you are in a scenario of not even knowing if you're going to leave the hospital with two legs.
yeah, exactly. And at the time, I mean, it was so surreal. I just kept thinking this couldn't be happening to me. I mean, this type of thing happened to people in movies. It happened to people in books. It happened to people you read about in the newspaper, but it doesn't happen to me. And it was so intermittent. I mean, there was a lot going on, and there were a lot of doctors coming to talk, but I very clearly remember telling the surgeon, please don't, you have to save my leg. Like, I'm a rider, I need it. And I do remember him saying to me, we will leave it. It was very late in the evening by this point, and he said, you know, I'm tired, I want to go home. I will set it overnight and we will operate on it first thing tomorrow morning, and you have, you know, 12 hours to see if the leg will survive, and if not, then it's gone. So I very clearly remember that conversation, and then, you know, the next morning everything was looking as good as it could look, and off I went.
Terrible, but yes.
I mean, to be honest, I was having a great time. They had given me all the good things, and I was not worried because in my mind, you know, I was in the best place I needed to be, hospital with all the doctors, and it was completely out of my hands, you know. So it was. I couldn't think too much about what if. All I could think about was, well, I'm here, I'm in the hospital, the doctors will take care of me, and I guess after the surgery, I will see if I have two legs or if I have one. But I also very clearly remember at that point, my dad being there as they wheeled me into theatre, and him standing on the other side of the doors as they took me away, and I remember sort of half loopily waving at him as I went through the doors, and he was trying very hard to be very strong for me, but I can imagine that it was a very unpleasant experience for the rest of my family. I was great, but I think it was very traumatic for everybody else.
And then the following years were really riddled with it seems like just one issue after another. It just seemed like there were so many ups and downs in your, I don't even know if you call it recovery. Like, it was recovery, but it was also just an extension of this injury. Like, it's like, just take us through just what those next few years looked like for you.
Yeah, it was. I think putting it as an extension of the original injury is a good way to phrase it. And that's exactly what it was. So it really felt like in the next few years that I took quite literally one step forward and two steps backwards. So there was the initial injury, and then there were consistently small problems that kept popping up. So then you would go to a specialist, you'd go to a surgeon, they'd find something else. And in the end, the list of injuries that I sustained in the accident became very extensive that had far-reaching consequences. And I ended up having multiple surgeries on my leg, on my knees. And then the recovery was just pushed out consistently. So the whole time I wanted to get back to riding. I mean, riding was my goal, getting back on the horse. And I was fortunate enough to have the horses at home, but that somehow made it worse because they were right out the front door and I couldn't do anything. And so that they were a source of motivation, but it was also sometimes very hard to see them sitting there and going to waste in the paddock. And then when I did return to riding, about 4 years after the original accident, I returned to full-time riding. So before then, it was very intermittent. I went back to the saddle for a couple of weeks, couple of months, then had more surgery. I was out for a few more months, and finally returned full-time to riding in about 4 years after the accident. And had a very nice young horse who I'd had at that point for a good 18 months and competed her. She'd been great, and I was getting on her at home one day, and for whatever reason, horses are horses, and she just started bucking as I was getting on. And she unfortunately dislodged me rather dramatically onto our concrete driveway, and I ended up fracturing 7 vertebrae in my spine. And so off we went to hospital again, and whilst we were at the hospital, I look back now and I think it's rather funny, but at the time it was not. And they were not certain then if the fractures in my spine were as a result of the car accident 4 years earlier, or whether my back was actually broken when I fell from the horse. So it was very unclear. And that's what I mean by everyone was so focused on my leg at the time of the accident, that nobody really thought to check anything else. So there was no x-rays ever taken of my spine after my car accident, so there was no way to definitively say you also broke your back in your accident, or no, it just happened today when you fell off your horse. So it was a bit eye-opening for me at that point as well, because I really remember lying in the hospital, and no one wants to tell you anything. You know you've got a serious injury because no one is talking to you, and I'd experienced that many times previously in the hospital. And it was a poor registered nurse that came in and started doing something, and then asked me a question, and I looked at him rather blankly, and he went, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I guess nobody's told you." And I said, "Told me what?" And he disappeared, completely red-faced, a slip of the tongue, and then the surgeon came in later and said, "Yeah, you've got 7 fractured vertebrae. We're discussing how to stabilize them and whether or not you need surgery or if you can go home." And at that point, I remember lying there going, is it worth it? Is it worth trying to push myself so hard to get back into the saddle if this is going to be the result? And how much more can I physically take before these rather severe injuries become rather severely permanent injuries? I was very fortunate that the fractures were in a spot where I didn't require surgery, but I toned down the riding for a few months after that, and then at that point seriously considered whether eventing was the path I wanted to continue on.
So, okay, as a true horse girl, you're talking about the effect that this had on your riding. Like, you're looking at this through like the lens of like the horses. But I have to wonder, over the course of this period of time where your life was so derailed by this split-second accident, what was your mental state like? Did you struggle with mental illness during this time? Did you feel like you were in a dark place at any point in this journey?
I did, but I think that came later. I think it's really interesting because I think people have a bit of a misconception that you have a very traumatic experience and the mental health detriment comes immediately after. But for me, it came many years later. Because for me, when you're in this recovery period, you have a goal. For me, it was never as traumatic, I think, as it was for everybody else in my family. Because for me, my recovery was completely in my control. I could determine how much I pushed it, how far I went every day, whether I got up out of bed every day. That was completely in my control. Yes, okay, I had several surgeries that were not planned, but each time I knew that I would be okay. And I think that's really hard for people who are around you because your recovery is not in their control. They don't know that you're fine, that you will be okay. And it was later when the dust had settled, so to speak, 5 or 6 years later, that then it became very clear that I had been suffering from quite a severe form of PTSD, and depression was obviously an issue. I suffered and still do suffer from rather severe anxiety at times. And that took a long time to be able to get under control. And I think you also don't know what's happening. So you expect it to come, but you don't realize when it hits you. It comes so gradually that you don't notice. So for me, it started with with having a short temper, being in a bad mood. It wasn't the classical not motivated, can't get out of bed. But likewise, it also wasn't that I'm severely angry at the world. It was more a sense of feeling incredibly frustrated, that things were not moving as quickly as I wanted, and things were slowly moving from what I could control to what I could not control. And then you go through the realization that this is sort of as good as you're going to get. So in the beginning, it's clear, you've got a broken leg, bones take 6 to 8 weeks to heal, and then you're fine. I mean, that's what we're told as kids. You break a bone, you see the kids with the cast on at school, and 6 weeks later, in what feels like the blink of an eye, they're fine again. And for me, that was my mentality. So, okay, I have a broken leg. 6 weeks, I'm fine. And then you realize, slowly but surely, it's now been 4 or 5 years, and this is not getting any better. And you start going to surgeons who tell you, you're lucky to still be here. This is as good as you're going to get. And that realization of, maybe I will never return to who I was before, that is what triggered the mental health issues for me, learning to accept that this was life now. And especially because it happened when I was so young. I mean, at 18, just out of school. I mean, what should you expect from your young life? And life was starting to look very different for me back then, and that took a while to accept.
5 years later, 5 years after the accident, was when your eventing coach at the time, who was the Australian Olympic rider Megan Jones, first uttered the prefix of para to you and said, Amelia, you might consider paradressage. What was your reaction at the time?
My reaction was absolutely not. I thought she was completely crazy. It was an immediate shutdown. There was no consideration. I don't even think she'd finished the sentence, and I just looked at her and said, "Megan, no, you're crazy." And we were actually at dinner at the time, and she brought it up, and she had coached or trained another very successful Australian para rider who competed in 2008 and 2012 at the Paralympics, and she suggested it to me, and I said, absolutely no way. I mean, firstly, I never identified myself as being someone who had a disability now, and secondly, I absolutely hated dressage. I did it because it was part of 3-day eventing.
So many eventers do.
It was honestly the worst part of 3-day eventing. I mean, everybody lives for the cross country. We do dressage under sufferance because we have to. So the thought of doing just dressage every day in a 60 by 20 arena, I mean, where's the fun in that? So the answer was absolutely no, I'm not doing it.
Yeah. And yet.
Yet, here we are.
And yet. And so how did that, two things, you had to concede with two things there. You had to reckon with two things in your mind. One, that perhaps the goals that you had when you were younger were no longer the goals that were suitable for you. And second, that you were all of a sudden having to reckon with, am I a person with a disability, or am I a person that just has an accident in her past? So how did you inch yourself towards making this decision to maybe take a little bit of advice from her?
I think it was very gradual. There wasn't a split decision where I said, okay, I'm going to do this now. So I ruminated on the idea for some time, and in the end, I did what I do best. I researched and spoke to people, and I reached out to our paradressage team in our federation and had a chat with them. And the question was actually, first of all, would I be, or were my disabilities something that could be classified, and would I be considered a para rider? So that was step one. So I started talking to them about it, because actually if they said, well, no, sorry, no, you don't qualify, then problem solved, So I spoke to them and got some information and started to investigate it. And they were really nice, and in a very kind way said paradressage is very competitive, and the quality of horses, quality of riding is insanely good. Yeah. And I'm sorry to say, but your eventing horses are not going to cut it. And I was highly offended, because I really loved my eventing horses, and I thought, they were the best horses in the world. And So after many months of talking and going back and forth, it was suggested that if I really wanted to be serious about it, I should take a trip to Europe and see what professional dressage over here really looked like. And was it something that was interesting to me? So about 5 years after my accident, my mom and I got on a plane, traveled to Germany to have a look at some dressage horses and see what the market was like, and meet with some trainers and find out what would it take to have a horse here. And our 3-week I'm going to have a look trip turned into a 2 a.m. phone call to my dad of, I just bought a horse, and guess I'm staying. And yeah, so that's kind of how it started. And then for that year, so the plan was I would stay in Germany for 6 months. So I kept my eventing horses at home because I thought, well, worst comes to worst, if it's not something for me, I still have my horses back home. I still have that tie. And over the 6 months turned into 1 year, and I found new homes for my eventing horses to fund the one dressage horse over in Europe. And 7.5 years later, here we are.
Yeah, okay. Could you explain just briefly for maybe people who are not listening, you mentioned that there's the grades with para dressage. How are these riders classified, and kind of what made you, because you're, I think, grade 5.
Correct, yeah.
What qualifies you for that grade specifically? Just for people who may not, like you, going into it, understand what that process looks like.
Sure. So in para dressage, we have 5 different grades. So grades 1 through to 5. Grade 1 is for people who suffer from the most severe impairments. So quite often combination of debilitating diseases such as cerebral palsy, things like this. And in grade 1, the requirements for competition is walk only. So walk only test, but showing all 3 paces in walk. So extensions, collected, and working paces, as well as various movements. Then you have 2 and 3, grades 2 and 3, also competing in a 20 by 40 arena, but with trot elements involved in the test. Most commonly, people in this grade you see, so for example, my teammate from Tokyo, Emma, she is grade 3. She's a paraplegic. So you see quite often those types of disabilities. Grade 4 and 5 are the least amount of impairment that people have. So involved in these tests are walk, trot, canter, and they're competed in a 20 by 60 arena. So same as an Olympic size Grand Prix competition. And the differences between grade 4 and grade 5 vary quite a lot. So you see quite a lot of riders that have MS, for example, a lot of them in grade 4. Another friend of mine, she competes for South Africa. She's got partial paralysis down one side of her body, so she's also grade 4. And for me in grade 5, it's traditionally or usually with people who have 1 to 2 limbs affected, but their core function remains quite good. Okay. So you see quite a range of disabilities and impairments in para dressage. And they're split between 2 different categories. So people who have acquired the disability, so like me, as a result of an accident, or something that's developed during life. So traditionally, most of them are riders before, and they're normally horse-related accidents. Or similar to me, there are quite a few car accidents as well. And then the other side of it is their congenital things, so things that people have been born with.
When you approached Helen to do some training, first of all, how did you and Helen meet, and what was that initial conversation like? Did you tell her what your goals were? Just take me through that process.
Oh, that's going back quite some years now. So I've been with Helen since 2017. So I've been with her going on 7 years now, so quite a long time.
How has it been 7 years since 2017? In my head, 2017 was 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's this weird time warp between 2020 and now.
COVID just really, it messed all of our clocks up.
It's insane. I mean, we had a slightly off topic, but I was discussing the other day about social life outside of horses, and I made a joke that the last time, yeah, exactly. I made a joke that the last time I was in a nightclub was several years ago, but it was still in this decade. And then I sat there for a minute and went, oh, hang on a minute, it was in 2019. It wasn't in this decade at all. So I totally understand what you're saying. But actually, I approached Helen in 2017. I was training with an Australian rider based over here, and she had suggested that I was ready to spread my wings and move on to a more professional stable with more options. And I simply approached Helen and said, "Hi, this is who I am, and do you have a space in your stable?" And at the time, I was very lucky. She actually had one available coming up in a couple of days. So very quickly ended up in her barn. And initially was training with her head rider. And it was when I then bought a Genius, the horse I ended up taking to Tokyo, that I started training with her full time and sat down and had a serious discussion with her saying, I want to go to the Tokyo Paralympics and I want to train with you, and these are my goals. And she was very open to the suggestion and very, very helpful. And she actually helped me with the decision whether or not to buy Genius. So I found him, I tried him a few times, but I was really not sure. You know, it's a big decision. Is this the horse that's going to get me to the Olympics? I mean, how do you know? And so I relied on her expertise, and almost 5 years now since I purchased him, and 5 years of training with her. So it's been good.
The added layer that we have not even discussed yet, though, is that you have this whole other side of your life. You are not training and riding all day long. This is not your source of income. So in 2020, so after a few years after you bought Genius and moved into Helen's barn, you also got your master's. You completed your master's in international space law?
Yes, yeah, I did. I did.
I don't even know how to put a bow on all of these things. You are a very multidimensional person.
I don't think you can, to be honest. I'm not sure how to do it either. But no, that's absolutely right. So, going back to the point of my accident. So I was enrolled at a university close to home, and I was studying criminal justice back at that point, and my goal was to work in some sort of law enforcement, maybe. Wasn't really sure. So the problem was just before the end of my school, but prior to the accident, the car accident that I had, I wanted to be a pilot. That was my goal. I wanted to be a pilot. I thought that was the coolest thing ever. I love to fly. So I got my pilot's license at 15, and then around a year later had fall off a horse and ended up with a brain injury, and unfortunately was medically grounded from flying. So that put an end to my flying career at that point. So I was a bit sort of stuck right at the end of my schooling career, was medically grounded for 5 years. And when you're 17, it's 5 years seems like an eternity. And so I enrolled in the university close to home, criminal justice, and thought, well, you know what, I will look for some sort of career in law, and then 5 years will fly and I can go back to flying. So that's how I ended up in that degree. And of course my car accident came about, and I was not able to study at the university because at that time the university was not wheelchair friendly. So I ended up switching to completely online study. And then I needed something.
That is shocking to me.
yeah, it was not at all wheelchair accessible. And that's the other thing that you don't realize, going from very able-bodied to suddenly being completely dependent in a wheelchair, how incredibly frustrating it is to be so stuck when it comes to accessibility.
Gosh, that breaks my heart.
So, for example, disabled car parking spaces on the side of a hill. It's not practical at all, and we had an incident where my mother helped me into my wheelchair. She had to lift me from the car, and she put me into the chair but forgot to put the brake on, and off I rolled down the hill toward the main road. we had many adventures like that. All turned out well, but you're also left with this very overwhelming sense of this is highly impractical and not okay. So
Yeah.
So again, university was not wheelchair accessible. I couldn't drive. The university was an hour from home, so switched to completely online, and then realized this degree was not going to cut it with how life was going to look. So I ended up transferring to a double degree in law and criminology, and completed that online, and then completed it actually from Germany. So graduated in 2018, and then thought, well, I'm on a roll. Why not go for a master's degree and get that done whilst I'm here and training for Tokyo? So I graduated from...
Yeah, why not? Because that's what everyone does.
I mean,
I'm just going to train for the Olympics and also get my master's. It's cool.
Why not? So that's actually what I did. So it was a 4-year master's degree and finished it in about 2.5 years. And it was in international space law because I thought it was really cool and it was interesting. And I thought, well, let's be I'm a very ambitious person. I thought, let's be really ridiculously ambitious and become an international space lawyer, because I think that just has a cool ring to it.
Man. And that was a conversation that you had with Helen, where you basically had to say, look, I'm not going to sort of be your typical student who's devoting my entire life to this. And a lot of that is financially necessitated for you. There was no hidden massive bank account where all of this horse money was coming from. It was not raining down on the sky. You were kind of having to hustle in order to be able to fund your dreams of going to Tokyo.
Exactly. So unfortunately, that's the sad reality of the sport, is that it's very expensive, and in Europe even more so than in Australia. And Helen has been great. She's very understanding that not everybody has unlimited funds to throw at the sport, and there's a career involved in that as well. And at the time, so even though I had this master's degree and I ended up doing my my graduate diploma in legal practice and then becoming admitted to the court in Australia as a practicing solicitor, was not able to work as a lawyer here in Germany because I don't have a German qualification. So I was teaching English for minimum wage, and then came COVID and everything got locked down. So I wasn't receiving any money at that time, and Helen was very supportive and very understanding, and when the opportunity presented itself to to apply for a full-time job, I had that conversation with her and said, this is a full-time, very serious corporate job. I won't be able to train during the day. Could we find a solution? And she was wonderful, and she said, no, absolutely, you have to do what you have to do. I'm here for you. Let's agree on very early morning training, because I think that's practically the most feasible option. And if you have to travel for work, I will take care of him, and we do it that way. And so that's, as luck would have it, I ended up being successful in the interview process for the corporate job. And I've been working in that role now for 2.5 years. And for 2.5 years, I've been getting up at 4:30 in the morning to train, and then working as a corporate M&A lawyer. So not a space lawyer, but still a very, very interesting job.
I love that story because it is an example of asking for what you need in order to be able to make it work. And I think that that's the thing that sometimes, maybe even especially as women, we get a little paralyzed by, is, well, I want these two things. I don't know how to hold space for both of them. Maybe there often is a financial component. I mean, this sport is so bloody expensive. Like, there's almost always a financial component. And so we have to get more comfortable culturally with having those types of conversations and not feeling any sort of shame about it. And I love this example of you just plainly stating, look, this is my reality. How can we make it work. Because if this conversation is happening in the room of somebody like Helen and somebody like you, then certainly it gives normal people like myself permission to have those same conversations and figure out a way to kind of make the puzzle pieces fit together. And also, you know, when you're taking on two massive endeavors like this, there is a hidden cost. There is a personal cost. As you just mentioned, you hold a ridiculous schedule. So what do people need to understand about what this actually takes?
I think it's a very good question. I mean, it comes at a very high price. I think that's something that people need to be aware of, but I think they also equally need to be aware of it's absolutely possible. I mean, I think it sounds very daunting, but I think for me personally, I think if you want it bad enough, you will find a way to make it work. And I'm very fortunate to be surrounded by an incredibly enthusiastic and motivated team who will do whatever it takes to make sure we succeed. But equally, you have to put in the effort. You know, I'm the one getting out of bed at 4:30 in the morning. And granted, it's not as glamorous as it seems. You know, it's dark most of the year. It's cold. I'm in the stable alone, so it is quite lonely. It is true what they say. Sometimes it's lonely at the top. And the personal sacrifice is that you're some kind of high-functioning, permanently exhausted pigeon. I think that's a way to put it. But it's really rewarding, and I think it's absolutely what you said. It's being able to ask for what you need, but also looking at the situation in front of you and going, what can I make out of this? How can I make it work? And I think people get really stuck in 9 to 5, and you know, outside of those hours, things are perhaps not possible. Whereas for me, my day starts at 4:30. It can sometimes end at 10 p.m. And it's the industry I work in. Yeah, sometimes we do have meetings because we're meeting people all over the world, so dealing with time differences as well. And yes, you don't have much of a social life, but you can surround yourself with people, very like-minded people, very, very driven people who understand what it takes to function at that level. So I think you can apply that to any situation. You know, if you're riding 3 days a week, but it's something you love doing, then for 3 days a week, that's your goal, you know, that's your focus. And I think that's perfectly fine. And if that's rewarding to you, then I say go for it. You know, if that's what you want, don't ever think you can't do it. If your goal is, I want to ride 3 days a week because I love my horse, or I want to brush my horse 3 days a week and take an hour for the two of us, then you know, make that time, make it happen, because it's so rewarding when you can do it.
Yeah. You used your vacation days from work to go to Tokyo.
I did.
I love this story.
I did. So it's a very interesting story. So the whole way I ended up getting this job was very random. I mean, it's the power of social media, you know. So I was having a very poor me day, and I think that's also important to realize that it's not every day you don't feel motivated. You don't get out of bed and go, I love my life. And it's not as glamorous as what it seems on social media at all. And I was having a very poor me day because it was during COVID. I hadn't been home. I hadn't seen my family. I'd completed my 6th degree at that point. And I was having you can have all these degrees and you can have a horse in Germany and you can compete at this level, but it doesn't mean anything if you can't buy food because you don't have any money. I mean, that was the reality of my situation at that point. So I posted on Instagram that I had received the results of my master's thesis. And although I was later very happy with the results of the master's thesis, I was being a bit, having a little bit of a temper tantrum about the fact that it's great to get such a nice result, but it doesn't mean anything if no one will hire you. And a very nice follower on my Instagram page, she messaged me and said, I just want to check in, I follow your stories, everything okay, and congratulations. And ended up chatting with her a little bit. And we texted back and forward a few times on Instagram, but I'd never met her. And she said that her company were looking for people to hire, and should she put my name forward? And it's based in Germany. And I thought, well, nothing will come of it. I don't think it's it's very hard to know if it's a genuine, will result in something genuine. And so I said, sure, why not? And she actually contacted me the next day and said, I've spoken to the managing director. He's really interested. Could you send him your CV and get back to him? And I was like, oh, German company, I have to translate everything into German. Who can be bothered? I can't, and so I thought, I'm not going to do it. And she contacted me again, and she said a few days later, he hasn't heard from you. Did you send it? And I thought, well, you know what? I'll send it in English. Big company, I'm sure they can read it. And sure enough, within a day, I received a response saying, we're really interested. Could we have a get to know you call, please? And so I did. I had a Zoom call in the middle of COVID with 3 very intimidating senior executive members of a big corporation that were very nice and friendly, but I, little foreign Aussie me sitting there feeling very intimidated, and they were very nice, and then met with some of the other team, and in end of the day I ended up having 5 interviews with the company, and in the last interview it was an in-person interview that went for 4 hours, and very much like you, they were like, why international space law? I mean, that's so weird. And, it was a very interesting interview, and the company was very new, very, it was basically a startup, and it was a branch of a very big family-owned German company that's been around for 105 years, and they were moving into an investment section of manufacturing and things like that, but they were really branching out. They were looking to pump up the team, but they didn't really know what they wanted or what they needed, and it was a bit like, we're happy to find a position for you if you're happy to work for us. And at that point I was so desperate, I needed any work, so I thought, well, you know what, corporate M&A is a far stretch from international space or international criminal law, but let's try it. Yeah. And at the end of the interview they asked me, when can you start? And I was like, well, about that.
It's a little Easter egg to this conversation.
Yeah, so, and of course it had come up because the immediate question over here is like, you're Australian, why did you move to Germany? And then you explain why. I came for riding, came for horses, goal is going to the Olympics. And this was in 2021, and in June of 21, they wanted me to start on the 1st of July. And I said, well, I'm shortlisted for the Tokyo team, but I won't know if I'm on the team until the 5th of July. And if I'm on the team, I will be gone for about 6 weeks. And the managing director sort of laughed, and he said, no worries, we'll deal with that if it comes up, And so I thought, okay, well, seems okay. It started on the 1st of July, and 5th of July, I got a phone call from the Australian selectors saying, congratulations, you're going to Tokyo. And I was so, on one side, extremely amazed, and then I got hit by a ton of bricks and went, oh no, how am I supposed to tell this brand new employer, by the way, I need to go to the Olympics? And so I sat on it for about 3 days, and I was terrified to tell them. I thought, I'm going to have to tell them because I don't have any holidays. I've just started in this company. And my boss ended up calling me one afternoon and just saying, he just wanted to check in. But he also remembered I'd said I would find out on the 5th of July, and it was now the 9th of July. And did I have any news? And I thought, well, shit, can't get anything past this guy, typical lawyer. And then I thought, okay, you're just going to have to do it. So I was like, well, in a very tiny little timid voice, I went, well, I'm going to Tokyo. And then I waited for his reaction. And then he was silent. And then he went, well, let me be the first to offer congratulations. And I was like, oh. And so, and then the question was about holidays. So we did a pre-export quarantine in Aachen for 3 weeks. So I worked from Aachen, from the quarantine facility, and then I took holidays for the actual Olympics, the competition period in Tokyo. And I didn't have enough days, so they transferred days from the following year into 21 for me to be able to go to Tokyo. But then that meant that in 22 there was not many options to take leave because I'd used it in 2021.
Yep.
So yeah, they were really amazing about it, and the whole team was and you know, I just started in this company. I'd been there a month and then I was gone, and they were so supportive. And when I got back in September, they were at the end of September, they were so incredibly happy to see me back and amazed. And it didn't really hit me until a few years later, you know, sort of now, about how incredible that whole story unfolded. Because when you're living it, it doesn't seem so incredible. But now looking back, I think it's 2.5 years later, looking back, starting at the company was crazy.
Absolutely amazing. I'm sure that there are not that many stories out there, and was certainly a first and maybe a last for that company, that will ever be their situation, working somewhere for 4 days and then learning that you're going to be taking 6 weeks off. Yeah, that's a wild story. You know, you voiced to me that you had mixed feelings about your performance in Tokyo, and it struck me because I just, you know, I knew of you and I followed you, and, you know, we cheered you on and everything. And I thought it was just amazing. Tell me why.
Yeah, I think I think it's really hard to say. I think on one hand, you go there because you want to be incredibly successful, and success looks different for everyone. To go to the Olympics is such an incredible honor, to be able to compete for your country and to go to Japan, and remembering that the world at that point was in such a state of crisis with Tokyo. I mean, even to have the luxury to be able to leave Europe at that point was so incredible. And I dreamt about it for so long. I mean, I think when we first spoke, I said to you, the games, and you can never say you've been to an Olympics until you actually ride down that center line, because so many things can happen. And so for me to get there, and then we were there 10 days before the start of the games. So, you know, you're in the athlete village and you're training every day, and the horses had a massive flight from Europe, and there's so much pressure. And in the end, the goal for me was to come away. The success looked for me to come away that at the end of Tokyo, I wanted to do two things. I wanted to qualify for the freestyle, which for your first Olympics is rather ambitious, I think. And I wanted to come away at the end of the competition and look back and go, I didn't leave anything behind. I gave everything I had in that arena, and there was nothing I could have done better. I didn't want to have any regrets. I didn't want to come out of it and go, oh, if only I'd pushed a bit harder in the extended trot, or if only I didn't ride so much in the corner. I wanted to look back and go, I did everything I could have done for that point in our training, and we didn't leave anything outside of that arena. And so that was the point of success that I wanted to go in with. And we did. We qualified for the freestyle, which was huge. And we improved on our ranking. So we qualified in 8th position, and we finished 6th in the world at the end of the freestyle. And I was very happy. I was extremely proud of Genius. I think he gave everything he had. I mean, he was such a solid rock for me in Tokyo, and I think we were for each other. But there's always that little part of you that wants to come away with a medal. And a lot of my close riding friends who were in Tokyo with us competing for their countries, they came back with medals, you know, and you feel a bit like you're so happy for them because it's a testament to their hard work. But on the other hand, you're like, you know, I really wanted that to be me as well. I want to be up there with them. I want to be standing on the podium. And you don't go to the Olympics to come last. You know, you go there and you want to do as best that you can do. So it was a little bit disappointed on one level, but it took me a bit of time to reflect on it and look back and realize that we did the best we could possibly do, given everything that was working against us with COVID, and not having seen family or friends, and not having been back to Australia for years, and going to Tokyo completely alone. You know, it was my horse, my groom, and me. We didn't have Helen there. We didn't have my parents there. And my parents have been my biggest supporter for years. You know, they've come to every competition. And Tokyo for them was as much of a goal as it was for me, you know. Absolutely. So I think there were so many things. And to say I'm disappointed is true, yes. But I think it's not the only feeling I have
Sure.
about Tokyo.
Yeah, you
So,
can, all of those things can be true. It's and, not but. And I've heard this sentiment from a number of riders who have, had results at really big championships, whether, it's the World Games or the Olympics, that a number of things can be true at one time. A number of feelings can exist at one time. And one of those feelings for you that you expressed to me was that the Olympics did not offer you some golden ticket to having life figured out or having things handed on a platter to you. There was no, and not that you ever expected that, but that going to the Olympics inherently does not make your quest in this sport all of a sudden so much easier. Talk to me about that.
yeah, I think it's so important to understand. It was a surprise to me in a way, because I think as a young rider, as a up and coming rider, you look at the Olympians and you look at their amazing stables and their big trucks and their sponsors and really amazing horses, and you think, wow, that's where I want to be. I want to work for that, and these guys, they work every day for that. And
Yeah.
I think there is some sort of expectation that when you've been to an Olympics, you've really made it. You can say, now I'm an Olympian, I've been there, and I've been to a Paralympics, and I'm a Paralympian. And I think with that comes the expectation that getting sponsorship will be easier, approaching bigger brands and approaching big named brands and saying, guys, I've been to Tokyo, can we work together? I've made a name for myself. That there's this expectation that it will suddenly become a bit easier, that big owners will come out and say, hey, you did so well, here, have a nice horse. And I think that's so far from what I personally have experienced. I mean, for me, that didn't happen. In the lead up to Tokyo, I had a lot of sponsors approaching me, and I was like, yeah, this is it, it's really happening. And then after Tokyo, almost within a week of getting back from the Olympics, I actually had quite a few sponsors then say, yeah, thanks, we're done. And that was so surprising for me, because I wanted it to be a long-term thing. We had Tokyo in 21, World Championships in 22, and then Paris in 24. So for me, in a very short space of time, we've got 3 big championships. Unfortunately for us, European championships are not possible. But it was really surprising that, trying to find a horse is very hard. Trying to find a horse as a backup for the one you have, so you've got 2 campaigning for World Championships, was extremely hard. People are just not willing to entertain the idea of giving you a horse to ride, and that was so surprising to me. And so there was never this aspect of looking back and going, yes, I finally made it. It's constant work to, once you make it, to stay there, and you have to keep looking for sponsors, and you have to keep doing the finances every day and going, okay, can I buy food today? Do I feed my horse? Do I feed my dog? Do I replace the kitchen appliance that's been broken for years? And it's such a frightening reality of the sport, that it's so hard to make it. But once you make it, it doesn't get any easier. It's not like climbing Everest and you get to the top and you take in the view and then you get back down again. You have to keep going.
Do you think that Paralympians and the Paralympics specifically do not receive enough attention?
I think it's hard to say. I think it's getting better. I think it's definitely improving. And you can see that by the Paralympics being broadcast on a much broader, wider scale then. So my first experience with the Paralympics goes back to when Sydney had the Olympics and Paralympics in 2000. And that actually was the time where I watched the show jumping and thought, I want to do this. I want to go to the Olympics. 20 years later we did. But back then, the Paralympics were not broadcast at all. They certainly weren't broadcast around the world. And now, in Tokyo, it was the widest audience watching a Paralympics. So I do think it's getting better. And I think if you look at the Paris Games, it's the first Games that will have the same symbol for the Paralympics and the Olympics combined. Every other games preceding it has been different, and I think that doesn't help. So I think it's, in answer to your question, yes, it's getting better, but I think it still has a ways to go. I think there's also a bit of a misconception in the wider public that if you go to a Paralympics, it's somehow less meaningful than going to an Olympics. I think for any athlete, that's not the case, regardless of if you go to the Olympics or Paralympics, because you know what it takes to get there. But just in my everyday life, where you come across people and you say, I went to the Paralympics, like, oh. But if you say I went to the Olympics, like, oh, wow, that's so cool. So I think there is a bit of a gap, but I do think it's getting better.
Okay. Let's talk about where you go from here, your next steps, because, I mean, your story is such an amazing example of how life is this. It's like a timeline of seasons, and it's a timeline of those priorities changing within those seasons. Until now, you know, horses have really been a constant, and now you have this massive, very successful career, and this massive, very successful career as an athlete. What is next for you? Where do you go from here?
Yeah, I mean, Paris is a year away, so
Yep.
you know, why not? That's sort of short-term goal. Paris is next on the cards for us. We will start our qualifying procedure next year, so beginning of 24, and then after Paris, I mean, you're faced again with the question that every athlete has, every rider has. So I have one horse. And the question is, do you find him a nice home after Paris and look for something younger, something a bit better? Or do you reinvest some of your money into a much younger horse and then keep it and train it and miss World Championships in 2026 and aim for the 28 games, which I think are in Los Angeles, if I'm not mistaken. You know, or do you keep the horse you have and keep working because you're a really good partnership and go for 2026 World Championships with him? You know, I think that's the question I'm looking at now. I'm not sure what comes after Paris. I think that's really hard to say. And I think every rider goes through it, and this is why I think sponsors are so important, because ideally you would have a range of horses, you know, up and coming, that you don't miss a championship year, because as one steps down from top level, another will come up to take his or her place. But the reality is, to do that, you need a lot of capital, or you need to be highly successful. And I think in show jumping and in eventing, it's much easier to achieve that than it is in dressage. So yeah, who knows? Short-term goal is Paris, and then I guess we'll figure it out from there.
So in other words, there are a number of 4:30 a.m. wake-up calls ahead of you. That is not going away.
No, that's definitely not going away. Definitely not. But it is what it is, and I can't say I don't enjoy it. So I really like my training every morning, and there's something satisfying about. Although the 4:30 a.m. wake-up calls are not enjoyable, there's something very satisfying about having a very successful training and then traveling back home and starting your workday knowing that you've had a really good training. So
yeah,
I really enjoy that.
If nothing else, you know, goes well that day, at least you've checked that item off your to-do list.
Exactly, yeah, and I think it's a nice way to start the day. I mean, this morning, for example, I had a really good training and really enjoyed it, and we worked on one particular thing, and he did it really well, and it was really nice. It was a nice way to start the day, so that part I really enjoy.
I did not prepare you for this last question at all, so we can. If you need to take a minute, we can edit this part out. If you need to take a minute to think of this, but we do this thing at the end of each episode. It's called 3 Little Things, and so my question for you is, what are 3 little things that anyone who is listening can do to become more disciplined, to hold that? Discipline is just a contract with yourself, right? Like it is honoring the promises you make to yourself, whether, that's how you're going to be, it's how you're going to behave, it's what you're going to do. You are an incredibly disciplined human being. So what are 3 little things that anyone can do or anyone can strive for to become more disciplined?
I think the first thing is find a routine. So find a routine that works for you, do something that's achievable. So second point is do something that's achievable. Don't start out with saying by the end of week 1, I'm going to be riding 1 tempi changes. Set very, very small achievable goals and tackle it in chunks, because that helps with the discipline. It helps you feel like you're being successful and you're achieving something. Build that into your routine. And third point, take a day off. You don't have to do it every day. I mean, take a day off. And I guess the second point to that is, if you really don't feel like doing it, then it's perfectly fine to take the day off. But you have to learn to distinguish between today is a rest day and I'm 50% motivated to do it. Really do it, and then reward yourself with that day off.
When you're having a day that you are 50% motivated and you're grappling with, do I get out of bed at 4:30 in the morning? Do you have any strategies? I mean, that scenario is more regular than you think. That was this morning. I got home from work at nearly 1 a.m. Got up at 4:30, so it was a very, very tough morning this morning. And for me, it's something I'm compelled to do. My strategy is don't linger in bed if I have to get out of bed, and I have to roll from the bed into my riding clothes, roll out the door. And once I'm in the car, it's fine. But the strategy for me is that I lock onto the feeling of when I'm done, when I've had a successful training, when I've spent time with my horse, when I feel like I've achieved something. That's what I use to get out of bed. If I don't go to the stable because I don't have what I think is a genuine reason, so I just can't be bothered today is not a genuine reason for me, I feel so incredibly guilty and really restless. So I think a strategy for me is, I lock onto that positive feeling at the end of a training, and that's what I use to push myself out the door at 4:30 in the morning. Amazing. Amelia, it's such a pleasure to know you. It's such a pleasure to hold space in this conversation with you. It has been truly my privilege to get to know you these past couple of years and get to know your story. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.